Mother-in-law dictated her rules in my house. You will do everything I say because I am smarter and you loser, she said. I smiled and kicked her out. 2 days later, when my wife, you will do everything I say because I am smarter and you are a loser. Mother-in-law Margaret sat at the head of my dining room table as if she owned the place. In her mind, she probably did. My wife, Emily, sat next to her, smiling into her wine glass. It wasn't the first time I'd heard this kind of talk, but something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way she said it, like a final statement. Like she really believed I would never fight back. For 4 years, my mother-in-law had lived under my roof, dictating her own rules. She criticized the way I lived, the way I worked, even the way I breathed. She never missed an opportunity to remind me that her daughter deserved better, someone richer, more ambitious, someone who wasn't me. I had a steady job, a respectable one. I paid my share of the bills, but it wasn't enough. Emily wanted more. She wanted a lavish lifestyle, a $1 million business she didn't have to work for. She wanted vacations, designer clothes, expensive jewelry, things she thought a husband should provide. My work didn't impress her. My consistency didn't impress her. And thanks to Margaret whispering in her ear every day, my wife had long since stopped pretending to respect me. Margaret had even gone so far as to threaten me, saying that if I didn't step up, she would make sure Emily found someone who would. She had her sights set on Brian, our neighbor, a single businessman with money to throw around. She made it clear that Emily would be better off with him. I never argued. I never fought back. I just kept quiet. Until tonight. Margaret took another sip of wine and grinned. It's about time you did something useful, Richard. Get a real job. One that can fully support my daughter, so she doesn't have to waste her life splitting bills like some common woman. And while you're at it, buy me that car I've been looking at. $15,000. No big deal if you weren't such a loser. Emily laughed like it was the most sensible thing in the world. She didn't even look at me, just swirled her wine and waited for my reaction. I exhaled, slowly. Then for the first time in years, I smiled. A real, genuine smile. Pack your things, I said, pushing back my chair. The room fell silent. Margaret blinked. Emily frowned. What did you just say? My wife asked. I kept my voice calm. I said, pack your things. You're leaving. Both of you. Margaret scoffed and shook her head. Don't be ridiculous. I slammed my hand down on the table, so hard the dishes rattled. Now, Emily flinched. Margaret's face contorted in disbelief. You wouldn't dare, she hissed. I stood up. I could feel the years of pent-up resentment boiling to the surface. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. For a brief moment, I actually thought about hitting her, but I stopped myself. Instead, I did something worse. I told her the truth. You are a miserable, controlling, selfish woman who has done nothing but make my life hell since you set foot in this house. You're a parasite. You've poisoned your own daughter into thinking she's entitled to a life she doesn't deserve. And the worst part? She actually believes you. You have no place in my house anymore. Margaret's face fell, her eyes watering. You ungrateful dash. I don't care. I cut her off. Then I turned to Emily. You want to live with your mother? Go. You want a husband who'll throw money at your every whim while you sit around and do nothing? Go find one. But it won't be me. Emily stared at me, stunned. She had no words. The next morning, Margaret was gone. But Emily stayed. She didn't speak to me for 2 days. When she finally did, she had a lot to say. And that's when the real war started. For 2 days, Emily didn't say a word to me. She walked around the house like a ghost, arms folded, eyes cold. I wasn't sure if she was processing what had happened or just waiting for me to break. Maybe she thought I'd apologize. Maybe she thought I'd beg her to stay. But I didn't back down. Margaret was gone. I hadn't asked where she'd gone, and I didn't care. The house felt lighter without her constant nagging, without the weight of her judgment hanging over me. I slept better those 2 days than I had in years. I went to work, came home, ate dinner in peace. And then, on the third day, Emily finally spoke. "I can't believe you did this." I looked up from my laptop, barely acknowledging her. "Did what?" She scoffed. "Don't play dumb, Richard. You kicked my mother out. She had nowhere to go. Do you even care? She's a grown woman. She'll figure it out." Emily crossed her arms. "You didn't even give me a say. You just threw her out like garbage." I closed my laptop and looked at her. Did you expect me to keep letting her treat me like garbage? In my own house? Emily rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. She was just being honest with you. She wanted you to be better for us." I laughed. I couldn't help it. She really believed that. She wanted me to buy her a car, Emily. Emily's expression didn't change. So, I stared at her, waiting for some sign of reason, some flicker of the woman I had married. But it wasn't there. Then she smiled. "Well, it doesn't really matter, does it? You think you've won, but you haven't. My mom will be fine." I raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean?" She leaned against the counter, smiling as if she had a secret. "She's staying with Brian." I blinked. "Excuse me?" She laughed. "Oh, come on. Did you really think my mom had nowhere to go? Brian offered her a place the minute you kicked her out. And you know what? He's been nothing but supportive. He's even helped me figure out my next steps." Something inside me tightened. "Your next steps?" I repeated slowly. She shrugged. "I'm just saying, Richard. Brian actually listens to me. He understands what I deserve out of life. Unlike you." I clenched my jaw. "Are you saying you're leaving?" She tilted her head, pretending to think about it. "Maybe, maybe not. But if I did, I wouldn't be alone for long." I exhaled through my nose. "So that's it? You're just lining up your next husband before you even leave?" Emily laughed. "Oh, stop being so dramatic. I'm just keeping my options open." I nodded slowly, my hands gripping the edge of the table. I had put up with this for years. Years of working my ass off while she and her mother belittled me. Years of thinking that maybe, just maybe, things would change. But now I saw the truth. Emily had never loved me. She loved what I could be if I made more money. If I gave her the lifestyle she wanted. If I became someone she could brag about. But I would never be enough for her. I got up, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" she asked. I didn't even look back. "To get divorce papers." Her laughter stopped. "You're kidding." I opened the door. "You have 2 days to get your things together, Emily. And if you think Brian's such a great guy, you can live with him." For the first time, real panic flashed across her face. "Wait, Richard, let's just dash." I didn't wait for her to finish. I walked out, slamming the door behind me. The war was over, or at least I thought it was. But I had no idea what came next. I was sitting in my car outside the lawyer's office, gripping the steering wheel. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't fear, it was adrenaline. 4 years of being treated like nothing, of being a punching bag for Emily and her mother, were about to end. The divorce papers were in the passenger seat. I had them drawn up in a matter of hours. No waiting, no hesitation. She wanted to. Keep her options open. Fine. I just closed the one she had with me. When I got home that night, Emily was waiting in the living room, arms folded. "Okay, Richard," she said, her voice tight. "Let's talk about this." I threw the papers on a coffee table. "Nothing to talk about." "Sign them." Her lips pressed together. "You're being ridiculous. You're really going to throw away our marriage over a fight?" I laughed. A real bitter laugh. "One argument?" "Emily, this has been 4 years of your mother running this house. Of you acting like I'm some kind of failure for working a normal job instead of making millions. You never respected me. I was just the guy who paid for your life while you waited for someone richer to come along." Her expression darkened. "That's not true." "Really?" I crossed my arms. "Then why is your mother already setting you up with Brian?" She flinched. Just a little. "Yeah," I nodded. "I know. You didn't deny it yesterday, and I can see in your face that you love having this backup plan. But I'm done being your safety net. Sign the papers and go live your dream life next door. Emily's eyes narrowed. You're going to regret this. No, I said calmly. I won't. She didn't sign it that night. Instead, she stormed upstairs and slammed the bedroom door. I spent the night on the couch, not that I minded. The silence was a relief. The next morning, I awoke to find Emily had grabbed a suitcase and left. No note, no text, just gone. I expected relief. I expected peace. Instead, I felt a strange tightness in my chest. Something wasn't right, and I was right to worry, because 2 days later I got a phone call from Brian. Richard, he said, his voice tense. I need to talk to you. I frowned. About what? There was a long pause. Then he sighed. Just come over. I didn't know Brian anything, but my curiosity got the better of me. I went next door and knocked. He opened the door, looking exhausted. Then I saw them, Emily and Margaret, sitting in his living room. Emily looked smug. Margaret looked like she just won the lottery. Brian ran his hand over his face. They showed up 2 days ago. Said you kicked them out? I crossed my arms. I did. Margaret spoke first. Brian understands our value. He's a real man, not some pathetic little worker bee. I looked at Brian. His jaw clenched. Something was wrong. Emily smiled. You're looking at my new home, Richard. Brian has been so kind to help me with the transition. I just nodded. Right? Well, that's great. Have a nice life. I turned to leave. Brian grabbed my arm. Wait. I raised an eyebrow. His voice dropped to a whisper. Get her out. I blinked. What? Brian glanced into the living room, as if to make sure they couldn't hear. Then he pulled me outside and closed the door behind us. I made a mistake, he said. I let her stay for a few days. Their ex-wife, said she needed time to sort things out. I didn't think much of it. He ran a hand through his hair. But man, these women are crazy. I grinned. Yeah, no kidding. He shook his head. Your mother-in-law is demanding things left and right. She's already talking about redecorating my house. Emily acts like this is her house now. She doesn't clean. She doesn't cook. She doesn't do anything but spend my money and tell me how to live. I let out a low whistle. Sounds familiar. Brian sighed. I try to be nice. But when Margaret started talking about how I should buy her a car because it's a man's job to provide, he shook his head. I knew I screwed up. I crossed my arms. So what do you want from me? He looked at me desperately. Help me get her out. I chuckled. Nah, not my problem. Richard, come on, man. I dash. The door burst open. Margaret stood there with her arms crossed. What's taking so long? Brian stiffened. Margaret, listen, dash. She waved a hand. Oh, shut up. Real men talk. I saw something snap in Brian's eyes. Margaret turned to me. I knew you'd come crawling back. Can't handle life without Emily. Can you? I grinned. Oh, no. I'm just here to enjoy the show. Margaret frowned. What show? I gestured to Brian. Tell her, buddy. Brian took a deep breath. Then he squared his shoulders. Margaret. Emily. Get out of my house. Emily shot to her feet. Excuse me? Brian's voice was steel. You heard me. Get out. Right now. Margaret's face turned red. You can't do that. We live here now. Brian let out a cold laugh. You think you can? This isn't your house. You were guests. But I'm done. Emily's face twisted in disbelief. But Brian, we need you. You said you wanted a partner, someone to share your life with, Dash. I wanted a friend, not a financial burden. Emily's mouth dropped open. Brian pulled out his cell phone and tapped on the screen. I've already called a locksmith. The moment you leave, the locks will be changed. Margaret looked genuinely shocked. You wouldn't dare. Brian shrugged. You said it yourself, Margaret. Real men make the rules. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Emily turned to me, her expression desperate. Richard, please. I cut her off. I gave you a choice. You made it. Now live with it. She opened her mouth, but I turned and walked away. When I reached my front door, I heard Margaret screaming and Emily pleading. I went inside, locked my door, and let out a long breath. It was finally over. Or at least I thought it was. I finally felt free. For the first time in years, my house was mine. No insults, no demands, no one calling me a failure. I could wake up in peace, eat my meals without anyone judging me, and spend my evenings as I pleased. But peace doesn't last when you've pissed off the two most entitled women in the world. 3 days after Brian kicked them out, I came home from work to find them standing in my driveway. But they weren't alone. Margaret, Emily, and a policeman. I frowned as I pulled up and got out of the car. The officer looked at me, then at Margaret, who had a look of pure smugness on her face. "Richard," she called out, fake sweetness dripping from her voice. "We need to talk." I ignored her and looked at the officer. "Is there a problem, officer?" He sighed, clearly already tired of whatever nonsense they were spewing at him. "Sir, these women claim you illegally evicted them from his property." I blinked. "Excuse me?" Margaret jumped in, her voice shrill. "This is my daughter's home. Richard kicked us out with no notice, no legal paperwork, nothing. We have rights, you know." I let out a short laugh. "You don't live here, officer. This is my house." Margaret was never on the lease, and Emily left voluntarily. Emily stepped forward, her voice suddenly soft. "Baby, please. I didn't want to leave forever. I just needed space. But I'm back now. This is still my home." I turned to the officer. "Can I prove that you don't live here anymore?" He nodded. "If they're not listed on the lease or mortgage and they moved out voluntarily, then no eviction laws apply." I pulled out my phone and opened the security camera app. I pointed the screen at the officer and played the footage from the morning Emily had left, suitcase in hand. "There," I said. "That's her leaving on her own. And I can also get Brian to testify that they moved in with him right after that." The officer barely looked at her before turning back to me. "Sounds like you're in the then." He turned to them. "Ladies, you have no right to be here unless you have a legal document proving your tenancy. I suggest you leave." Margaret's face fell. Emily's eyes went wide. "Wait, but I'm his wife. I have a right to be here." The officer looked at me. "Are you two still legally married?" I grinned and pulled the divorce papers out of my pocket. "Not for long. She refused to sign, but she's not living here while she drags her feet." Margaret lost it. "You monster. You're leaving my daughter because of a stupid little fight. Do you know how many men would kill to have a woman like her?" I shrugged. "Then she can go find one. Maybe Brian's still available." Emily's face twisted in anger. "I gave you everything, Richard." I raised an eyebrow. "Everything? You never even respected me. You treated me like a paycheck that wasn't big enough." Margaret stepped forward, shaking with anger. "You will regret this. You need us, Richard. You're nothing without us." I smiled. "I think I'll take my chances." The officer sighed. "All right, that's enough. If you two don't leave right now, I'm going to have to charge you with trespassing." Margaret and Emily looked at each other and realized they had lost. Margaret huffed. "Fine, but don't come crawling back when you realize what a mistake you've made." Emily turned one last time, her eyes searching my face. "Are you sure about this, Richard?" I met her gaze, and for the first time in years, I felt absolutely certain. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. She swallowed, then turned and walked away. The officer gave me a nod before following her off my property. I went inside, locked my door, and exhaled. It was finally over, or so I thought, because 2 weeks later, I got a call that made my blood run cold. It was Brian, and this time, he wasn't calling to complain. He called because Margaret and Emily had ruined his life. His voice was frantic. "Richard, man, I messed up. I really messed up." I sighed, already knowing the cause. "What do they do now?" "They ruined everything." He groaned. "I let them back in." I know. I should have just cut them off." But Emily came back crying, saying she had nowhere else to go, that you had turned into some cold-hearted monster. I felt bad, man. And Margaret? She played the victim perfectly. Said she was an old woman with nowhere to turn. I shook my head. Let me guess. They didn't just stay for a couple of days. Oh, they moved in, he said bitterly. Within a week, they were treating my house like it was theirs. Margaret started redecorating without asking. Emily maxed out my credit cards. They refused to clean, refused to cook. And if I dare to complain, they call me selfish and ungrateful. I almost laughed. It was classic. And then Brian continued, voice rising. Emily got comfortable. She started talking about our future together, about how I needed to take care of them properly. Then Margaret had the audacity to say I should put the house in Emily's name, since I was so in love with her. I nearly choked. Are you serious? Oh, I wish I was kidding. I leaned back, smirking. So what did you do? Brian let out a dark laugh. I evicted them. They made me sit up. Wait legally? Yep, he said, satisfaction clear in his voice. I realized if I let them stay any longer, I'd lose everything. So I talked to a lawyer. Turns out, in my state, if they stay past a certain number of days, they can claim tenant rights. So I had to do it fast. I whistled. And today was the deadline, Brian said. I had them served with a formal eviction notice. They lost their minds. Margaret called me every name in the book, screamed that I was a disgrace to men. Emily tried to pull the poor me act, but I didn't fall for it this time. He sighed. This morning, they had to pack their bags and leave. I grinned. So where are they now? That's the best part, Brian said, chuckling. Margaret has no money. She burned through her savings years ago. And Emily? She never worked a day in her life. They called everyone they knew, begging for help. And no one wanted them, Brian said. Their friends? Gone. Their family? Sick of them. The only person who agreed to take them and was some cousin 3 states over. I laughed. I really laughed. So they're gone? Gone, Brian confirmed. And good riddance. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Margaret and Emily had spent years treating me like garbage, acting like they were untouchable. Now, they were broke, homeless, and completely alone. Brian chuckled. I gotta admit, man, I don't know how you lasted for years. I smirked. I don't either. But I do know one thing. What's that? I leaned back in my chair, savoring the moment. They'll never be my problem again.